People often struggle with the Old Testament and the God that's portrayed there because they see him as very cruel, very genocidal, very judgmental. And the question we have to ask is what we see in the Old Testament compatible with the New Testament? Is it the same God at work? Is it two completely different things? Do we take one and do we discount the other? And how do we reconcile all of this? Something that I've really enjoyed about Bible study in particular, and especially the way that this Bible has it set up. This is the Remnant Study Bible. You can see there, you might be able to see there, the Remnant Study Bible. Something that I really enjoy about what this Bible does is it introduces you to every book. One of the parts in the introduction is showing you how you get to see Christ through the book. I think that's super important because of the issues and the questions that I talked about at the beginning of this video. When it comes to the book of Lamentations, we get to see Christ here. This is Old Testament. This is in the midst of what was described as the funeral of a city, something very graphic, the Babylonian captivity and the destruction of Jerusalem. We get to see maybe something different than just what people would think of, a God who's abandoning his people, a God who doesn't care about humanity. We might see something a little bit different by understanding how we can see Christ in the book of Lamentations. So let's check it out. The weeping prophet Jeremiah is a type of Christ. This concept here, you have type and antitype, and this is something that we see all throughout the scripture. But basically what it is you have kind of the think prototype and product, right? So you have something that comes before that, at least in principle or by example, you get the better version later. And that's type and antitype. You have type, which is like the prototype. That's like the first version of it, the early stages of it. And then you have antitype, which is what the type was supposed to represent in the flesh, in reality. So Jeremiah apparently is a type of Christ. Interesting. The prophet who wept over the same city 6 centuries later. And we see this exactly when we look at Jesus and some of his words recorded. Where does it say? In Matthew 23, verses 37 and 38. And here's what he said. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." Like Christ, Jeremiah identified himself personally with the plight of Jerusalem and with human suffering caused by sin. So it's interesting. You have type, you have antitype. You have these two individuals, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament, who are both expressing grief, trauma, sadness about what's happening to not just Jerusalem or the idea of Jerusalem, but for the people and what it represented as a connection with God. So how do we see the similarities there, right? Well, in the Old Testament, the whole reason that the Babylonian captivity came about was because of what people would summarize too simplistically as just sin. Israel did the wrong things, and so they excluded themselves from the blessings of God. But it's deeper than that. If you remember the previous video, we talked about sin being not just this idea of right and wrong, but about relationship. And sin being something that separates you from God, it puts more distance between you and God. So it makes the relationship with God much more strained. Not committing sin is more about being in better relationship with God as opposed to simply just doing something that's right and something that's wrong. Now, why is that important? Because what it would mean then for Old Testament Israel is that the cause of this is really ironic here. The cause of this whole Babylonian captivity and all this bad stuff that happened to them wasn't just, well, they did the wrong thing, so Babylon comes in and takes over. What was the thing? The thing was the relationship with God. The irony being that as a nation, they really felt like they were closer to God, but they were missing the point because they weren't extending the same blessings that they had received from God to the people around them. It was much more exclusive, where they were keeping people out of that and trying to use it as something to make them different and set apart, as opposed to being invitational and inviting people in. That's what the sin was. They didn't fulfill their mission duty in extending the relationship that God had with them to other people. So we see Jeremiah now lamenting over this, the funeral of the city that failed to come through on what it was supposed to in the Old Testament. In the same way, we see Jesus expressing the exact same thing in the New Testament when it comes to how he sees Jerusalem, understanding what's coming. And what would that be? The destruction of Jerusalem yet again, this time by, I believe, the Roman forces that come in and really put an end to kind of Israel as a nation at this point in history. So it's fascinating. We see the exact same thing regarding God and Christ in the Old Testament as we do in the New. The reason that I think this is important, going back to the first question that I brought up here in this video, is that the context that we gain from being able to see where Christ fits into the Old Testament, I think will help us better understand what happens in the Old Testament. A lot of people look at the events and they say, wow, this must mean, they use the events to define God, instead of seeing how what we understand about God shows us the meaning of the events. It's backwards. And so if we're willing to see how we can experience Christ in the Old Testament, I think it gives us a better context and perspective of what's happening there. I'm not saying it makes things any easier to digest, because it's true. People going into a land and eliminating people by the nation, women, children, that's hard to deal with. It's hard to swallow. But I think better context might give us somewhat a better perspective to where we may not like it, but we might be more understanding of it. Not always easy, but being able to see Christ in Lamentations especially, I think there's such clear connection. And generally speaking, there is a lot of clear connection between the Old Testament and the New, but a lot of times we separate it because of our misconceptions of who God is in the Old Testament and our misconceptions of who God is in the New Testament. Lamentations also includes elements that typify Christ's life and ministry as the man of sorrows who was acquainted with grief. He was afflicted, despised, and derided by his enemies. And we see all of this recorded in the book of Lamentations. So, in short, we can see Christ in the Old Testament if we're willing to look. We have to be willing to let go of our preconceived ideas of who God is as a tyrant, and these are really ideas that Satan implants on our minds when we read through this stuff, which prevent us from really seeing God for who he is. But if we're willing to let go of that, then we can see Christ in the Old Testament, and then we'll be able to better define and better understand the situations and the events of the Old Testament, because we have a better understanding of who God is. That's the key. And when we can do that, I think it makes for a better spiritual experience. We're able to relate to God a lot better because we're seeing him in a more accurate light. And I mean, shoot, any life I think you can have with more understanding about something is going to be a better life. So we'll see how all of this plays in. And we'll have to keep in mind that as Jeremiah is expressing himself and his sadness for this city, there's echoes of Christ there as well. And I think that's very important. When you think of kind of this concept of God being so genocidal and just rooting for the destruction of people, I think it's unfair to God on a number of levels, obviously, but I think primarily when we don't understand God as weeping for his people, and when we don't understand who God's people are, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, when we don't understand that God's people is really all people, then by cutting that out of the picture, it makes it easier for us to look at God as being unfair for what's happening there, as opposed to the sadness that he actually has when his people are experiencing harm. And by his people, I don't just mean Israel or Christians, I mean everybody. So understanding that dynamic, it's tricky, it's complex, but only through a better relationship with God and being able to see Jesus and and how the Old Testament and the New Testament really show us the same God, I think we miss out on a lot of that. And we really put ourselves in a really tough position of trying to accept an Old Testament God versus, or at the expense of a New Testament God, and vice versa. So it'll be interesting to see how we get to see it here. But Jesus clearly cares about his people. And by his people, that's all people. So we'll see how that plays out in the book of Lamentations. 2 more sections to go in this overview, and all of it still is making me scared and nervous about what we're going to find here in the book of Lamentations. But I think it's going to be insightful. I know I'm going to learn a lot. I've already been learning a lot just in the reflection and looking over this context. So I'm excited to see, scarily excited to see what I'm going to learn here, especially because, as I said, this isn't a book that I've really looked at in depth before. So it'll be cool. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one, and we'll keep it pushing. All right, peace.